Welcome to the video on relative clauses in Latin. This is Mr. Hayden at Divine Child High School again. You're probably a Latin 1 student or early Latin 2, so with that in mind, I'm going to keep the sentences and examples to about that level. But it's important to note that going into this video, I assume you know the difference in English between who and whom. And I also assume that you have access to the forms of qui, quo, quod, because if you do not, it would take up too much time of this video to go over each one of them. And so this is more of a video on how to utilize the relative clauses themselves and not just the forms and the basic translations in Latin and English. So with that in mind, we can go forward. We're going to talk about antecedent, and we're going to talk about how they work in sentences. But hopefully after 2 or 3 slides, this should be fairly clear. Feel free to rewind at any point if you need further explanation. So as we begin with relative clauses in Latin, we have to remember that Latin loves that words agree, not just with word order like in English, but in things like gender and number and case a lot of times, but that's going to be the kind of the caveat here. And so that relationship between words is reflected even in the relative clauses. And so we have to ask ourselves always, like, if we say, like, who, we have to know who, like, we have to know what words or people or whoever is in the sentence that relative clause who is modifying. Like, who are we talking about when we say who? And so Latin has a method for that. It's called the antecedent. So we have antecedents that agree with their relative pronouns in number and gender, but not necessarily in case. And that's given right here in this statement here. They agree in number and gender, but not necessarily in case. And so I have an example down here to show you to see if we can figure this out. So we're going to do a quick label here. For time's sake, I'm just going to kind of label some cases and numbers. So these guys are all accusative. They're the direct objects. They're plural. Hector is your subject. He's nominative singular. And then you get a clause. Quorum starts a clause. Keep in mind relatives start clauses. Going through your verb poterat, that was me skipping ahead because I wrote the sentence and I already know. But this is genitive. It is masculine or neuter, and it is plural. Quorum is. Patres and matres are going to be either nominative or accusative. We have our infinitive pugnare, and poterats are verb. And we end up having patres be nominative because we have no other ideas for a subject. But you can also argue that pugnare would be an intransitive kind of verb most of the time. And then ducebat is our main verb. So if you're thinking about this is a main sentence, you have omnes troianos hector, ... ducebat. All right, so there's a lot going on there. Let's switch to blue. And we have to ask ourselves, what does quorum refer to? Does it refer to Hector? Is he the one that we're talking about? Or are we talking about all the Trojans? Well, let's take a look. We have a masculine idea there, but the thing is, these guys over here are all masculine. And so we need to make sure we understand that the masculine part is not what helps us here. It's genitive, but again, we don't actually care about it agreeing in case. And so that genitiveness is going to be handy when we do that clause itself in translation, but for now we actually don't need to care about that for the antecedent. We do need to look at how it's plural though, because Hector is singular and these Trojans are plural, and if it agrees in number, that means that you're dealing with agreement with the Trojans, not with Hector. It seems a little bit obvious if you're like, well, you can't have more than one father and mother, like mothers and fathers. Hector probably won't have one father, one mother, and therefore that it's pretty obvious. However, in English, if you said Hector and all the Trojans in the same sentence and then said who, you either have to assume the most recent one mentioned or you're going to be ambiguous. So you have to make sure that you're very clear about antecedents. All right, and then the sentence would translate something like, Hector led all the Trojans, whose fathers and mothers were not able to fight. The reason it's whose, that's an interesting one here, is because it's genitive. It's talking about a possession. So most relatives will have who or whom, and if it's like if it's qui, that means it'll be nominative and therefore it'll be who. If it's quem or quos, it's probably gonna be whom because the accusative is usually the direct object. But with genitives, it's a possessive and therefore whose makes the most sense. So whose fathers and mothers are not able to fight. We're gonna do two more examples on the next slide, and then we'll wrap the video up. All right, so here are two examples. Let's just kind of dive right into the first one for time's sake. We're going to do not as much the quick labeling. I'll just label a couple things like the subject here. Here's the nominative. Aeneas is masculine and he's singular. Cum multisocies is the preposition, and these guys are ablative plural masculine. Ex urbe, urbe is feminine. Ad Italiam, Italiam is feminine. Fugit's the verb. Sorry for skipping over that. And then we get to quos. All right. So we slow down in a second. We see quos is accusative plural masculine. Okay. And so we don't need to agree in case because remember the case is what it does in its own clause. It doesn't need to agree with its antecedent in case. It just needs to agree in number and gender. So we have a masculine plural. Now Aeneas is masculine singular, so he doesn't apply here. Urbe and Italian are both feminine, so actually we're going to be talking about these socies here. So the socies, whom. Here's a good use of whom. And then within the clause you have quos is the direct object because it's an accusative. The graecae are going to be your subject being nominative plural. You have your infinitive, you have this nice preposition, and our verb. So your bracketing goes like that. Quos through potuerant. All right. So you get Aeneas fled from the city to Italy with many comrades whom the Greeks had not been able to kill in battle. First of all, this just makes sense because you couldn't, of course, take dead people with you to Italy, and so they are the survivors of the war, so the ones who the Greeks had not been able to kill in battle. But you'll notice how I did that translation. I put the socies near the end so that I could put the whom right next to them. You could, of course, switch it around. You can say, Aeneas, with many comrades, whom the Greeks had not been able to kill in battle, fled from the city to Italy. You can put it anywhere. English is very loose with things like prepositions. You can kind of put them in various places. So as long as it makes sense, and as long as in your English it's very clear that quos modifies the comrades. And so one more time for clarity, in case you are trying to write this down or something, the translation for this one. Aeneas fled from the city to Italy with many comrades, whom the Greeks had been able to kill in battle. A lot of prepositions there, so the parentheses are important. But the quos through potuerant clause, I think, is very a very good example of a relative clause modifying something before it that has multiple options. So you have Aeneas, socies, urbe, Italiam, all options, but because it is plural and masculine, the socies is the only one it could possibly go with. Okay. Down below you have amicus donum dated mihi, quod me felicem fecit. And so I let this one shorter because there's a different point I want to make with it. The amicus is the subject, the donum is the direct object, being accusative. But note it is neuter. That's going to be important in a second. It is neuter singular and it is accusative. It could also be nominative, but amicus is already nominative. Dated are verb, and then mihi is a dative. Okay, so keep those things in mind. But then when you see quod, boom, boom, you got a nice little clause there. You'll note that it's qui, quae, quod, which means that in the neuter column, quod could be the nominative or accusative singular. And so you have donum, the neuter singular direct object, the accusative here. And you say, okay, well, it's neuter singular, so it could definitely be the antecedent of quod. So there you go. The reason I wanted to point this out is for two reasons. One, the translation. So you have the friend gave me a gift, which made me happy. The gift is the thing that made him happy. And so use the word which when you have inanimate objects. When you're talking about people, you use the who and whom, but which for inanimate objects. You'll note that in Latin, sometimes like a tabula is like a table or a tablet. It is feminine, so you'll still say which because in English it's an inanimate object. In Latin, objects can have gender. I just tried to use a neuter for the second reason, actually. And that is that quod can because. You guys know this. However, when you have a neuter antecedent, it's actually relative. And so you have quod as an option. It's either because or it is which. And how to tell is simply if you have a neuter singular antecedent, it is which. If not, it is because. You can write that down in your notes if you do not already have it. So your final translation here, my friend, gave to me a gift, which made me happy. Notice the direct object, the object complement, so it's kind of like a subject complement, but it's actually the object, and then the verb vacant, which made me happy. All right, that means the quote is the subject, by the way. All right, moving on. This last example I decided to keep short. Hominum qui monstrum ostendevam, ego terui. You get some first person in the nominative, which is always nice, but the cool thing about this one is that you have cui. Now, cui is cool because the C takes the place of the Q in the dative and genitive. So you might want to look at those again, or else you might miss that it's actually starting a clause and is a relative, because you might be expecting a QU. I kind of get it, but the CU kind of does the same thing. And actually, another interesting thing about this sentence here is the I in here, terui, from terreo, terere, terui, tertus. And it is first person singular. You don't see, actually you do see it in text, but often it's easy to forget, I suppose. The I ending perfect active, meaning I verbed, in this case I terrified. So you have hominum, the accusative, the direct object, cui monstrum ostendevam. Cui is dative. That'll be interesting here in a second. And I did this so there wouldn't be a word order weirdness here. So the antecedent is hominum, dative is singular and masculine, hominum is singular and masculine, and you're fine. And then monstrum, that's your accusative. And then the bam means it's first person, so I verb. In this case, I showed. And then ego is the nominative of ego me, mihi me me. And so you have your nominative subject there. And then terui's your main verb. Okay? So here you have, I terrified the man to whom I was showing the monster. Again, I terrified the man to whom I was showing the monster. Notice the dative to whom. So if you have a relative in the dative, you can still use your to or for. In the genitive, you can still use your of whom or of which. I use whose for genitive. In the ablative, you can use with which, or you can use something like from which or where. There's a lot of ways to use the ablative, but notice that you can still use your cases the same way. So if you have a dative and you're thinking to, for, you can say to whom or for whom, and that's fine. You're allowed to do that. So I terrified the man to whom I was showing a monster. And with that, I hope you can rewind and get any clarification after listening to it again if you need it. Otherwise, you can email me or try to do more practice on a worksheet or something, see if it comes to you. Thank you.